Welcome to Season 3 of Purposeful Empathy. My name is Anita Nowak, and this show is all about amplifying the voices of people around the globe who believe the world needs more empathy and are doing something about it. This episode was brought to you by Grand Huron International, an on-demand coaching provider for individuals and companies. Thanks for watching. Enjoy the show. So welcome to a new episode of Purposeful Empathy. Today I'm joined by the one and only fabulous Michelle Holliday, who is a consultant, a facilitator, author, and researcher. And I can say that she's fabulous because she's also a personal friend. Her work centers around thrivability, which we're going to talk about, we'll unpack. But it's a set of perspectives and practices based on a view of organizations and communities as dynamic, self-organizing, and living systems. For clients in a range of sectors, she helps people connect more meaningfully with each other and serve life more powerfully and effectively through their collective action. Her research, perspectives, and practical experience are brought together in her highly acclaimed book, The Age of Thrivability, which we will include some information about in the description. Welcome, Michelle.
Thank you, Anita. So amazing to be with you.
I'm so excited for this conversation. I've had you in my class as a guest speaker, and you are by far one of the most popular guest speakers, which is why I'm always happy to have you come back. And I never miss when you speak, because even though I've maybe heard your presentation before, because I always take away new things from the conversation. It always inspires new ideas. And I absolutely love the way you take up the space and you make yourself so relatable, and you're very inspiring and you're very genuine. So I just want to say all of that to you up front.
Thank you.
Now, we have a set of questions that I'm excited to get into, but I was so struck because I have a little guest form, right, to ensure that our guests, are asked questions that will bring their work to life. And I ask my guests, are there any major takeaways from the conversation that you'd like to have? And I'm going to just read what you wrote. You said, thrivability is essentially the practice of purposeful empathy. Empathy towards all life, and purposeful empathy is at the heart of thrivability. So we've just discovered we're like sister soulmates.
Right,
so
right.
Can't wait to hear what you have to say about that. But let's start from the beginning. So what is thrivability? What does that mean? What does that word mean to you, and why is that important?
Mm-hmm. Okay, and I'm so happy you started with that key takeaway, because it was exciting for me to discover. I've always admired your work and thought that somehow it sat alongside and in parallel to mine, and is just wonderful and needed in the world. When you invited me to join you, I thought, okay, I want to dig more deeply. I looked through your writing and your podcasts and just reflected myself on what does purposeful empathy mean to me, and it just became clear we're doing the same work in different ways. So I'm really excited for this conversation. So thrivability is first a response to all of the overwhelming and even the small problems in the world that we see, that when I dug more deeply to find root causes for all of them, they led to this dominant narrative we have, this paradigm or worldview that tells us everything in the world works like a machine, and that we're separate from each other, we're separate from nature, separate from our organizations, and that we exist to compete and consume, right? And that's all. And so that story leads us to actions that are not filled with purposeful empathy, that have the opposite characteristics and lead to all these problems. So unless we address that fundamental underlying story, we'll keep perpetuating these problems. So what I discovered through research is that there is another story emerging, or it's the rest of the story. There are mechanistic characteristics to life, but that's not all. So if we kind of look up and around at the rest of the story, we see that there's also life, and there's also the opportunity to understand life, to be empathetic, to open ourselves to a deeper understanding of what it means to be alive, what it takes to enable anything that's alive to thrive, including ourselves and our organizations and our communities and economies, and to be in the intentional service of life wherever we are. So thrivability is this practice of enabling life to thrive, serving life's ability to thrive for individuals, for organizations as dynamic living systems, for communities as dynamic living systems, and for the biosphere.
And I know that, because you talk about mechanistic, right? Like, can you give examples of like what that looks like in our world? And then I know you also draw from the natural world to inform, the principles of thrivability. So could you speak to those?
Mm-hmm. So the mechanistic story is so all-pervasive that we don't even realize that we're living that out, that we're guided by those assumptions. But there are clues when our language is mechanistic. So the language of human resources and human capital, for example, that is dehumanizing and results in a relationship between people that is transactional rather than filled with empathy and purposeful empathy. So I think what that looks like then is toxic workplaces and stress and chronic depression and organizations that lead to the destruction of our life support systems. And we can't seem to figure out how to stop doing it, because our story doesn't allow us to see any other ways of being that are logical and reasonable. So then when we step outside of that story, or we embrace the rest of the story, then we find new language. So I'll often invite clients to pay attention to when you're using mechanistic language and see what else becomes visible and seems possible when you replace that with more organic language, just people and culture instead of human resources. I'm doing a lot of work in the tourism industry right now with national and regional tourism organizations and bringing together the sector in conversations about what that transition would mean. So we're shifting from managing the tourism industry to cultivating the hosting community. And can you feel the difference? Right. And there's so much purposeful empathy in cultivating the hosting community. So we're bringing people together in conversations as a hosting community to explore who are we and how do we need to host each other and our place and be hosted by it, held by our place. How can we find our way to caring for each other and for our place so that we then can turn to others, to visitors, and invite them in an authentic and meaningful way that nourishes all of us.
Yeah, and I imagine in so many sectors that holds true. Healthcare, education.
Right.
Yeah. So what are the scientific principles of thrivability? I know that there are you talk about these 4 principles, right?
Yeah, I do. So at a really basic level, it's useful to know 4 things. I talk about these as life's universal design principles. So without them, it might sound like it's just philosophy. We should just all get along or something. And that's valid and enough. But there's also a set of really practical guiding design principles that help us figure out how to do things in better ways. So the first thing we need to understand about living systems is that there are, in thriving living systems, there are diverse parts. So you and me, people, in a human system. And those parts are connected and supported in an infrastructure of relationship. And the parts come together in relationship in a way that creates an emergent whole, a new level of life with new capabilities and characteristics that we don't find at the level of the parts. And that's the magic that we're after, that the whole is greater than the sum of its parts and that new things become possible. And all of that, this is the most important thing, all of that is enabled by life, by whatever spark it is that animates us and makes us alive. And when we acknowledge that, then we can shift from seeing ourselves as drivers or mechanics, engineers of the machine, and instead see that we're more like gardeners or stewards cultivating the fertile conditions for life to thrive. And I'll just give you a quick universal example. This conversation is an example. So each of us are bringing our perspectives and our voices. I'm talking a little bit more than my fair share, but that was the plan. So if each of us can bring our diverse perspectives, and if we can establish a good flow of relationships, so if we take turns and if we speak the same language and we respect each other, and if we come together in conversation about something that really matters in human systems, human communities, what enables wholeness, the emergence of that, the whole that's greater than the sum of its parts, is purpose, shared purpose. So then we're not just a couple of people, who kind of bounce off of each other. Then we start to become a living system, and it starts to take on a life of its own. And if it can be truly inspired, if it's not overly scripted or choreographed or controlled, but we can follow the inspiration where there's life and there's energy, then the conversation will take on a life of its own and we'll be elevated, and I hope all of us have had the experience where we surprise ourselves with our brilliance, in conversations like this, like, where did I come up with that? Well, life came up with it. This context generated it. So that's what we want everywhere. We want that like inspired and brilliant flow of life.
And you came by this quite honestly, right? You're a corporate refugee. You had your own kind of odyssey and backstory that brought you to this. Do you feel like sharing?
Sure. I worked first at Coca-Cola. I was brand manager for the Coca-Cola brand for Russia, Moldova, and Kazakhstan. I never made it to Georgia, but anyway, I was disillusioned at how major corporations and the world approached customer relationships and community relationships and responsibility. It seemed like there must be more that's needed and possible, but everybody else seemed to think that was the best, in fact, not only a good way, but this was the model. And I also was disillusioned with internal corporate culture and how people interacted within the organization. I moved, I left Coca-Cola. I went into employee engagement, organizational development, and it was better. But again, the message was that the human spirit doesn't belong in business. And I heard that from more than one business leader. And I remember one saying, try the nonprofits. They're into that kind of thing. But the nonprofits were saying, no, we're trying to be more business-like. We don't want it either. And I thought, how does that make sense that the human spirit doesn't belong? And what do I mean by the human spirit anyway? So that's what led me to research and find, I think I mean whatever it is that makes us alive. And I think I'm looking for the story of our aliveness. Yeah.
So, your work maybe 10 years ago when you started was like extremely avant-garde. Do you feel crazy? Yeah, okay.
Plenty. Yes, exactly. Go on.
Do you feel that the world is kind of catching up? Is it mainstreaming? Do you feel like yes or?
I do. It's very exciting. And I remember about 10 years ago, someone saying, Michelle, just sit back because people have to get to the point of extreme pain before they'll really be able to open up to what you're saying. And I remember saying, I don't believe that. This is just logical. I'm offering something that's appealing. Wouldn't you want to thrive? And it turns out that he was right. And that the best thing, as tragic and terrible as it is, the best thing that could have happened in terms of our openness to a new story is COVID. It really has helped us see our profound connectedness with each other globally and with all of the ecosystems on the planet. It's forced us to pause and think about what really matters. And it's forced us also into that purposeful empathy. I heard you talking about this, that these kind of mutual aid societies and community efforts to help each other were necessary. And we discover it feels good and it works. And what if we could continue that and spread it? So yes, it's an exciting time. And I find that I have to remind myself that people will be open. I still sometimes go into presentations thinking, oh, well, I'll do my best. And then I'm astonished that they're really excited to hear it. So it's really good.
So does that mean you're hopeful about the future, even in the face of climate change right around the corner? I
am hopeful. And no matter what, I'm I'm hopeful in different ways. And I do this kind of fork in the road. Either we will get it together and stop the train that's headed towards a cliff, get off and create a beautiful village, or at least we will have developed the purposeful empathy to care for each other along the way. So I don't really like to think about that, but it's there. And either way, this is the work that's needed, yours and mine, right?
So let me dig really kind of concretely. How do you feel purposeful empathy is part of thrivability, or the heart of thrivability?
So I have this kind of short definition for thrivability that I share, that it is the informed intention and practice of enabling life to thrive, of creating the fertile conditions. So I think the first part of empathy is being informed, coming to understand, to see, to hear, to discern who are you and what's happening with you. So in offering these fertile conditions, this way of knowing and understanding any living system, it's a step towards empathy. Then informed intention. My invitation is, let's get explicit and clear that enabling life to thrive is the purpose. Whatever we're doing, that's the goal. Because currently we're setting our sights on something so far, so much less than life's ability to thrive. And we're getting something catastrophically short of thriving. So we have to aim for that. So that's where it starts to become purposeful. We set that as our purpose, right? And then the practice, informed intention and practice. I describe it as a practice of continually deepening in wisdom and compassion, and the ability to sense what's needed and to respond with effective action. So for me, that's purposeful empathy right there. And it's an individual and a collective practice. And that deepening in wisdom and compassion. I spoke yesterday morning to a group in India. And again, I was so excited and surprised. They're ready. They want this. And we talked about the Indian concept of seva, which is service to something bigger than yourself. And within this program that they're part of, they're learning that the purpose of life is to get to the point that everything you do is seva. And that's how I approach thrivability as well. And my kind of call to organizations in particular is that the purpose of your work is to cultivate the conditions for life to thrive, to be in that practice, and to create every project, every organization as a practice ground. That's the first and foundational purpose. What you do next, whether it's tourism or healthcare, that's secondary, but create a practice ground and be intentional about that. So it's all about purposeful empathy.
I want to just ask if you could share a concrete example of some of the work you've done where you've brought thrivability into an organization that was ready for it, and what that looked like and what the impact was.
There is a coalition of museums, of nature museums in Montreal. There's a botanical gardens, an insectarium, a planetarium, and a biodome. The biodome is for ecosystems under one roof. So you walk in, as you know, and you're in the tropical rainforest, and then you can walk through to a mountain ecosystem. And they were merged administratively by the city. They're owned by the city, but were four separate institutions. And at one point, the mayor wanted to put them in as one administrative organization. And maybe it was to save some money. We can fire some HR and finance people, or maybe it was also more visionary. The goal was to create one entity that would have a sort of bigger presence on the world map for tourists and other reasons. So the staff was not at all interested in being merged. They felt very different in different scientific disciplines, different histories, different sizes. The planetarium was in a different part of town. They were skeptical of branding, and his mandate was to create one brand. And they were skeptical of him. He came from the world of circus and dance. So he hired my colleague and me, and we came in and did a variety of things, but in all of it, we were sharing this living systems view of the organization, which was wonderful to do with biologists. Many of them were biologists, and care about nature and life. So we guided them through these 4 conditions that I described. So in one of the first major things we did was to bring all 450 people together for a day of exploration of what will it look like when each of you is able to bring the best of your gifts and contributions and to be nourished in the process. Let's imagine together what that will look like. What will that look like when your work flows not only efficiently, effectively, but joyfully and playfully? You know, what will that look like? And in exploring that shared purpose, what will create wholeness among the 4 of these separate institutions, we framed it as, what is the one conversation you all want to have with the world? I had talked about how a conversation is something alive and potentially generative. So in all of that, we were very open about listening for what the organization was trying to tell us, you know, kind of that life. We were being guided by the inspiration. So we came back afterwards with a draft manifesto, kind of a concise statement of, this is who we are, this is what we want, this is what has to be true. And we offered it to the directors and said, does this feel authentic? Is this what the group has expressed? And they said, it's really good, we like it, but there's one problem. You used the word life. And we don't talk about life, we talk about nature, because we're scientists and nature is measurable and tangible. I'm looking at my windows, you know, we can point to it right there. But life is amorphous and we don't know what it is, and it might even be spiritual. So could you just take out that word? And this director and my colleague and I, we all said, okay, hold on. This is really interesting and it's probably important. And we might want to dig more deeply into this, because you're biologists and you're uncomfortable talking about life. And if you can't talk about life, then who can? And maybe there's a connection between our inability to talk about life and our decreasing ability to sustain life on the planet. Maybe that's actually the one conversation you all need to have with the world. So they went through kind of 6 months of soul searching to kind of figure out, can we really go there? Can we talk about it? And in the end, you will know that they came up with a new name for themselves. Now, instead of just the Montreal Nature Museums, they are Espace pour la vie, which means a space for life. And they kept their individual diverse identities. They are still the Biodome, Insectarium, Planetarium, Botanical Gardens, but together they form a space for life. And they will tell you it's not a brand, it's a conversation, and it's a commitment. And as a result of this effort and this bigger, deeper conversation that they were courageous enough to have, and then to announce to Montreal and the world, they've had just amazing success. They changed their organizational structure to be more in line with these patterns of living systems. They changed how they do meetings to allow more inspiration. They changed the nature of their exhibits so that they're far more engaging and invite in art and emotion. And kind of the punchline is, they were unable to raise money for 7 years. They tried to raise enough money for the planetarium to be renovated, and they just never could. And within a year of announcing this manifesto and this new conversation, they were able to raise $190 million, build a whole new planetarium on site with the others, LEED Platinum, and do several other capital projects. So it's attractive and magnetic. Yeah.
Ah, I love that story. Even though I know that story, I love that story. So
yeah.
What advice, there's probably some people listening, watching that work in an organization and say, oh, I'm just like super drawn to this. It must be, on some level, we all know that this is like a better way, right? As you said earlier, who would say no to thriving, right? Right. So what would you recommend to organizations and to leaders to allow thrivability to kind of show up in their spaces?
I often offer two pathways forward, one that's easy, one that's harder. And I've already mentioned both of them. The first is pay attention to your language and notice when you're using terms from physics. So I have a client right now that has a 10-year plan. And the first is prepare. They've got it in 3 stages: prepare the ground, build the foundation, build momentum, and then accelerate. And I asked them, how long can you accelerate? Like, is that really forever? That's from then on. And how fast do you want to go? And I pointed out that those are terms from physics. And I invited them to explore what else comes into view if they think instead of preparing the ground and planting seeds and tending the garden and then harvesting. We can harvest forever and bring it back into saving the seeds and bringing them back. So that's the first thing. Think about your language. So the second thing I often recommend that people do is more challenging and requires more courage, and that's to ask bigger questions and have bigger conversations. So to ask what would it look like if each of us in this project could bring more of ourselves, could feel more at home in this work and even in our bodies, and what would support that, and what would it look like if our work flowed effortlessly and joyfully and effectively, and we felt a deep sense of belonging in the work, and what would support that, and what are we called to do together? What is the heroic opportunity that only we can contribute to? I find that people set their sights still so far short of what's really needed, and the times call for us to really step up. So ask bigger questions about that. And then what else would become possible if we allowed inspiration to flow through? And there are avenues into that. There are pathways through movement. And is it you who likes walking meetings? There's somebody in my circle who likes walking meetings. That's a fabulous way to invite inspiration in, and exposing ourselves to beauty and art and music. These open us up to life and the wisdom that it offers. So in our society, it takes courage to invite those into a business meeting. And yet there's so much more richness available and so much more access to the wisdom that's needed. So that's my advice.
Yeah, beautiful. You've recently put out in the world an article, which is based on a speech or a presentation that you made that has received a lot of reverberation and resonance, and could you share what that the theme of that idea was?
Yes. So I was invited to give a provocative talk at the end of a day-long conference, an online conference for sustainable brands. So it was a corporate audience. And the topic was pathways to a sustainable and regenerative society, something like that. And the question that was posed to me was something like, how can we get to that just and sustainable and regenerative society at best, or at least can we get to stakeholder capitalism? Or it's not just shareholders, but stakeholders as well, whose needs are considered. And that sounds good, a good step in the right direction. But my true belief, and I had permission to be provocative, I said that is a really dangerous framing and dangerous proposition. And the whole idea of stakeholder capitalism is dangerous, that we can choose which stakeholders get our attention and our care and our empathy. And we really can't stop short, and that we're still talking about capitalism rather than life's ability to thrive. And what I think that group really needed to do is think like a mother. And a mother knows that money is important to managing the household, but it's not the purpose of managing the household. And I sort of held my breath after saying that, and I couldn't interact with the audience. It was like this, it was the audience was not visible. But as soon as we finished, I got this flood of messages from people saying, I loved that you said that, and thank you for having the courage. And so, I continued the conversation. This whole idea of thinking like a mother is radical and revolutionary, bizarrely. It seems like what could be more universally acknowledged as beneficial and yet totally provocative and radical. It's led to some really good and important conversations.
And as you were speaking about, stakeholder capitalism gives permission that you might want to, prioritize which stakeholder gets the more attention. Like a mother, has multiple children, and you'll always hear universally through time that you can continue to love each one, as much as the other. Like, so I think that's part of it as well, right?
Yes. And it's expanding the purpose beyond serving and growing capital. And putting those terms together, it keeps us focused on the capital. And capital meaning money. Let's name it. It's money, right? We're talking about. And so a mother knows that's useful, but it's not the purpose. So let's shift the language, and it shifts our focus.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask if you can think of a story or whatever comes up for you when you've been at the receiving end of purposeful empathy and what that's meant for you.
So what comes to mind is just everyday things and the people in my life, like my mother. I mentioned I have this great relationship with my mother, and she's my biggest champion and supporter. She's so caring and supportive all my life, despite many, many hardships. And my husband, who I think for a long time didn't understand my work and was supportive of it anyway. And years when I didn't make money, in fact, I costed the family money. This was a big investment to grow this understanding and practice. And people like you, Anita, who have been there cheering along the way as well, and supportive and offering opportunities like this. And I feel really fortunate and grateful. And yeah, if you look for it, life is just filled with purposeful empathy, right? It's everywhere once you tune in and pay attention.
So that's a beautiful invitation. Who's listening and watching. I was asked on a podcast, I was part of a summit 2 days ago, what is something that, we could actually do right now to exercise our purposeful empathy? And I said, look for ways to do it. Look for ways to behave in an empathic way on purpose, right? So it's available to us all the time.
Yeah.
So thank you, Michelle, and thanks for watching, and thanks for listening. We'll see you at the next episode of Purposeful Empathy.
What if you had access to your own council of coaches to help you break free from your thinking clutter, make that important decision, and liberate you from whatever is holding you back? At Grant Huron International, you get to select the coach of your choice anytime from any place. Visit granthuroninternational.com to harness the power of on-demand coaching today.